The film industry has recently been rocked by sadness as Robert Redford, a Hollywood icon, ends his remarkable life journey at the age of 89. The man who once defined an entire era quietly passed away on September 16, 2025, in the quiet of his Utah home. It caused his family and innumerable loyal fans to suffer unimaginable grief. He was a force that elevated the art of cinema itself for over 60 years. Not just a figure on the big screen. Ordinary people earned him the Academy Award. He established Sundance, the haven of dreams for filmmakers. Additionally, he left a legacy that will endure forever in the annals of global culture. Robert Redford left audiences with a haunting yearning for a bygone era of greatness, as well as unforgettable performances and a unique elegance. The death of his firstborn son, the devastating losses and the unhealed wounds, however, left a soul scarred by cruel tragedies behind that glowing aura. Time was merciless, and now the cruelest blow has come from fate. It has robbed us of a warrior who was both beautiful and painful, who bore loss with remarkable poise, and who turned suffering into works that resonated with the most profound parts of human nature. We are seeing more than just Robert Redford's death. It is a monument's collapse. It is the extinction of a flame that enchanted generations in the past. It is the quiet of a voice that once roared against injustice and spoke of resiliency, love, and loss. Robert Redford's recent ordeal is not just another depressing chapter in a tragic life. Millions of people are left speechless in sorrow by this heartbreaking reality, which is a cruel blow to humanity's heart. Press the like button before we set out on this adventure as a heartfelt homage to a legend, someone who sacrificed everything for the world and now leaves a silence more powerful than fame itself. Robert Redford blazed as a golden Hollywood icon to the world, but in the precarious beginning of his life, he was trapped in a small bed, his youthful spirit dragged into shadows no audience would ever see, and his tiny body paralyzed by polio. As though fate itself was already determining how much suffering a legend's heart could withstand, shadows pressed down on him like a silent verdict. He was raised as an only child in Van Nuys with limited resources, while the long-lasting effects of the Depression still affected working families. He was born on August 18, 1936 in Santa Monica, to Charles and Martha, and he discovered too early how fleeting a young life could be. He was only 10 years old in 1946 when he first experienced the sting of disinfectant in the air, the oppressive weight of blankets that felt heavier than bone, and the fear of forcing a limb to move when it defied orders. "I thought I might never walk again, but my mother refused to let me give up," he would subsequently remember. Martha taught him that resilience sometimes comes not in victory, but in the silent refusal to give up, as she massaged his stiffened legs night after night and whispered hope into rooms where silence pressed like stone. The boy who would eventually control the screen had to first control his own fear by the late 1940s and early 1950s. He drifted into the orbit of a rough crowd in Los Angeles, restless and angry, slipping into reckless nights that were riskier than he realized. Years later, he acknowledged, "I was always looking for something I couldn't name." Even though he was only given a severe warning when the police stopped him one night for mischief and reckless behavior, the lesson was memorable. When he realized how close he had come to discarding everything, a steady hand from a protective father pulled him back from a precipice that could have destroyed his life. He found escapes to prevent himself from slipping again. The open sky that promised horizons, the fierce rhythm of sport that calmed a restless heart, and sketchbooks full of imagined lives. He demonstrated his value with a racket, even warming up tennis great Pancho Gonzalez at the Los Angeles Tennis Club. This brief encounter gave him hope that he might fit in somewhere outside of the forgotten nooks and crannies of a restless metropolis. However, fate had more in store for him. The most devastating blow of all occurred in 1955 when Robert was only 18. Martha, his mother, who had once given his paralyzed legs new life, went into surgery and never came back. His world's light went dark as what started out as hope turned into infection. The loss was complete for the only son she left behind, a rift that was more profound than any sickness had ever been. The house turned into a hollow shell, with every room resonating with the absence of her voice as his father, Charles, never remarried. All that was left was a somber boy and a severe man, both of them restrained by silence rather than comfort. The weak scaffolding of boyhood would collapse in an instant, and Redford would remember that year as the moment the ground gave way. He remarked, It left me with a silence I could never fill. And time did not break that silence. It followed him into adulthood, into public recognition, and into victories that should have felt like victories but instead bore the scar of a wound that no amount of success could ever cure. Extremes that cut like blades arrived in the mid-1950s. He felt 20 feet tall thanks to a sports scholarship to the University of Colorado, but it was quickly taken away by excessive drinking. As though the world had slammed a door before he had even learned how to open it, the shame of packing up too early was a stone he carried. When he was on the verge of giving up, he decided to go into exile. He lived simply while traveling through France, Spain, and Italy in his early 20s. He painted, drew, and walked for miles under strange skies until the noise inside of him subsided. Resilience is rarely loud, he would acknowledge years later. Even though fear has all the evidence to support it, it is still proceeding. He brought with him a resolute faith in art, a discipline developed on courts and trails, and a silently carved vow that when darkness returned, he would not give up but would instead confront it with work when he returned to New York in his mid-20s, both scarred and equipped with tools. This crucible served as the basis for the legend we lament today, a childhood that was painfully real rather than a smooth origin story. A body almost taken by illness. Grief cruelly rearranges a heart, errors that nearly led to his premature demise. And an awakening was earned in the most difficult way possible, through hardship, exile, and the lonesome will to start over. Robert Redford's return to New York in the late 1950s might have appeared to the outside world as just a young man pursuing his dreams. In actuality, though, it was the last-ditch gamble of a person already scarred by disease, loss, and shame. His will was made stronger by wounds that could have destroyed him. At the age of 22, he entered those winding city streets under flickering neon and the smell of wet pavement, not with the assurance of youth, but with the heavy burden of survival. The memory of his mother's death still fresh in his mind and the shame of a lost scholarship burning inside him. Clutching brushes and canvases like lifelines, he studied painting at Pratt Institute before, almost daring himself not to back down, enrolling at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. Acting was just another grueling ascent. With no sudden breakthrough or immediate success, he barely made ends meet at the age of 24 thanks to meager television roles in shows like Perry Mason, Maverick, and The Twilight Zone. But every word he spoke demonstrated that he had not given up. Years later, he would reflect honestly, saying, "It wasn't glamorous at all. It was simply a matter of survival." But there was irony even in survival. His greatest curse at first was the very face that the world would one day revere. Casting directors brushed him off as too attractive for depth and too well-groomed to be believed after ogling his golden hair and perfect symmetry. Once fighting to be perceived as more than weak or careless, the boy now fought an invisible battle to be perceived as more than a face. The cage was gilded. He later admitted, his voice still tinged with resentment, "You're inside, but no one thinks you belong." His appearance caused doors to open and then slam just as fast, enclosing the artist in a harsh beauty cage. Then came the chance that broke the chains in 1963. Redford played Elizabeth Ashley's young husband in Neil Simon's Barefoot in the Park on Broadway. And at the age of 27, he was able to finally stand on a stage and show what was burning beneath the surface. Critics were unable to ignore the wit, timing, and quiet vulnerability he brought to the audience night after night. The play ran for years after becoming a sensation. Redford, however, saw it as liberation rather than just victory. "They saw me for the first time. Not just my appearance," he thought afterwards. The audience's roar included not just applause but also vindication, the long-overdue recognition that he was more than just a pretty face. The screen unavoidably followed from Broadway. Redford entered the film industry when Hollywood called. Little parts at first, then major parts that showed what a force he was growing into. However, the pain of those early firings never lessened, even as his career accelerated. His need for independence, the desire to one day take over the camera and take charge of stories so that no one would ever again mistake him for a shallow idol, was sparked by that wound, which became the covert catalyst for his decisions. Now that we know he is no longer with us, the irony seems painfully poetic. The man who would revolutionize American film and create a platform for independent voices through Sundance started his rise by opposing the most heinous of misconceptions. That skill could be boiled down to symmetry, and it was during those years that Robert Redford's tenacity blossomed. from the dim television sets to the blazing Broadway lights. He demonstrated that he was a man, not a mask, and that he was an artist who fought for every inch. Broadway, however, was just the start. The movies that would launch his fame, spread his name across continents, and leave him etched in the annals of generations were waiting in the wings. A delicate ascent was about to burst into a soaring ascent, and it feels like fate written in both fire and blood as the world grieves for him. Golden light glistened on Robert Redford's ascent to the very top of Hollywood. However, beneath that brilliance were scars that the applauding crowds could not see, private conflicts woven into the very fabric of his notoriety. He carved iconic portraits that defined an era and appeared untouchable throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s, making him one of the planet's most bankable stars. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid features the Sundance Kid, the clever and cunning Johnny Hooker from The Sting, Bob Woodward, the unwavering journalist in All the President's Men, and Barbra Streisand's romantic partner in The Way We Were. Immortality could have been guaranteed by these roles alone. Every ovation, however, had a secret significance for Redford. Even as the world cheered, the chains of beauty, fame, and expectation silently tightened, obscuring every outburst of applause. The very face that millions loved was never a blessing without a curse, he later acknowledged. He was once flatly rejected by casting directors because he was too attractive. He also experienced the sting of suspicion even at the height of his success. Was he really more than symmetry and golden hair? More than a poster? It might resemble a cage made of gold, he admitted, his voice tinged with the resentment of a man who had spent his entire life fighting for acceptance. You are inside, but no one thinks you belong. He had to repeatedly demonstrate that he was an artist of substance, heart and conviction rather than a shallow idol, because even in triumph, the applause occasionally reverberated with skepticism. He carried that cruel contradiction like a burden the world never saw, and it became the thread of his career. The image that opened doors also threatened to erase him. The disappointment was more profound than reviews could ever express when The Great Gatsby failed to captivate audiences in spite of his presence. It was a mistake in the eyes of the public. It served as a harsh reminder to Redford of the harsh weight of expectations and the harsh reality that a so-called golden boy was never permitted to falter. But rather than backing down, he pushed himself into heavier, riskier projects, investing heavily in films like All the President's Men, where entertainment was given up for the truth and the film bowed not to escape, but to urgency. It was a torturous process, full of charges that he was overly serious and that he was afraid of offending people who had come to laugh while he delivered confrontation. Redford, however, was unyielding. He proclaimed, "Cinema has a duty to mirror reality, however uncomfortable." And he carried the loneliness of that belief like a soldier with invisible scars. Then came Ordinary People, the role that put him to the ultimate test. Every day on set felt like walking a tightrope under the watchful eyes of doubters waiting for him to trip. And the industry whispered that a handsome leading man could never summon the vision or discipline of a true director. But what came out was Victory, a sharp personal film that broke the taboo of loss and won him the Best Director Oscar. That Oscar meant more to Redford than just being acknowledged. It was confirmation, a reprieve from years of suspicion, that he was a skilled storyteller who belonged both in front of and behind the camera. But his hunger went farther. He established Sundance in 1981, which would grow to become the center of independent filmmaking. What the world now honors as a haven for dreamers started out as a flimsy idea, mocked by doubters without money, and sustained only by his resources and unwavering faith. His friends cautioned that he was taking too much risk. There were nights when it seemed like everything would collapse. However, he continued it, not for himself but for other people, to offer the stage he had previously found difficult to claim, to establish a sanctuary where unadulterated voices could at last be heard. In order for others to walk a more difficult path with hope, he endured the loneliness of a man who refuses to take the easy route, sacrificing peace, wealth, and even friendship. Therefore, Robert Redford's Golden Age brilliance was never just a gleam. It was brilliance tinged with pain, the crushing sting of expectation, the weight of beauty that frequently felt like a prison, the weariness of repeatedly proving oneself, and the never-ending strain of turning a frail dream into a haven. The victory was witnessed by the entire world. Redford endured the hardship. His legend, however, was created in that very struggle, not as a man who simply enjoyed fame, but as one who carried its shadows, battled them, and transformed them into something timeless. The truth is more evident than ever as we grieve his passing today. A star is remembered by the world, but the artist who demonstrated that the ascent is never pain-free even at the top lives on, and in the end, greatness is born out of fire rather than ease. Robert Redford's life appeared to the world to be a Hollywood fantasy, a much more personal tale of love found young, of brittle beginnings, and of a man who thought he had finally found a haven. No storm could threaten was revealed behind the spectacular premieres and thunderous applause. He married Lola Van Wagenen, a woman of quiet genius and unwavering grace, in 1958 when he was only 22 years old and still unknown to the world. She became not only his partner but also his haven. Their early years were devoid of glitz, with borrowed furniture occupying empty rooms, evenings spent spending as much money as possible, and hushed vows made under dim lighting that their wealth would come solely from love. Those first years with Lola were a revelation to Redford, who had experienced sickness, loss, and the pain of uncertainty. The chaos of the outside world seemed to stop when she was around. For the first time, he gave himself permission to believe in permanence and the straightforward miracle of a family establishing itself. Together, they created something rarer and more sacred than the Hollywood dream others had envisioned. A brittle sanctuary of defiance and devotion, a promise that they would weather any storms together. Neither of them could have predicted the brutality of the first storm. Their firstborn Scott was quick and cruel, and he lived for only a few weeks. His death caused the brittle haven they had created together to shatter under a sorrow too great to express. A suffocating silence, the kind that lingers in rooms but burrows into souls, descended upon the nursery they had painted with shaky anticipation, full of tiny clothes and dreams of lullabies. Once a source of silent strength, Lola's arms ached to hold a child who was no longer there, and every time she looked at an empty crib, it was a new wound that would not go away. Redford was also broken, bearing the indescribable knowledge that those lost days could never be restored by any amount of love or achievement. "You never heal from something like that," he would whisper years later. "Simply learn to get by without it." The reality, however, was more brutal. Not only did the loss surround him, but it was a part of him, influencing the hollow morning silence, the forced smiles that faltered before reaching his eyes, and the silent shadow that sat between husband and wife during the quietest hours of the night. He would become the Sundance Kid, a man who appeared untouchable to the outside world. However, he and Lola were forever changed by the ghost of a son who was taken too soon, and their love carried with it not only devotion, but also the indescribable burden of absence. Like a delicate flame quivering against the wind, hope returned to their home with the arrival of James Heme. However, it was a light that was always followed by darkness. His body was fragile and unprepared for the world when he was born, and every breath he took was a struggle, and every day was a victory forged out of hardship. Playgrounds gave way to hospital hallways. Sterile machines and their incessant beeping took the place of his childhood lullabies, and medical charts with their menacing numbers turned into a language his parents had to learn. After enduring interminable medical procedures, numerous surgeries, and 2 liver transplants, Jaime seemed to draw strength from his loved ones' hearts as well as his own will during each shaky recuperation. The double life was cruel to Robert Redford. During the day, under the glaring lights of Hollywood, he embodied the charisma and authority that the world required. At night, he sat in dark hospital rooms, holding his son's little hand and muttering vows he knew he might never fulfill. He carried scripts into waiting rooms, silently practicing dialogue as his own heart pounded with fear. It was like living under skies that never cleared, he once confessed to a friend. You had no idea when the storm would hit. The storm did indeed break. After decades of unfathomable fortitude, Jaime's arduous battle came to an end in 2020 due to bile duct cancer. He was 58. The loss was intolerable to Redford, who was by that point a weak old man himself, not only as a father but also as a man destined to endure the harsh symmetry of fate. As though the universe had come full circle to reopen a wound that had never fully healed, the echoes of Scott's death in infancy continued to reverberate across the decades. 2 sons, taken in different ways but leaving the same terrible silence, turned into the unbreakable shadow that followed him through all of his victories. Robert Redford, immortalized on screen, was a legend to the world. But to him, he was a father who had been broken twice and was destined to bear a burden so great that no accolade, no standing ovation, and no standing applause could ever fully comprehend. He was gilded by his fame, but beneath that radiance was a sorrow that was heavier and darker than anyone could ever understand. Lola stuck by his side through all the storms and heartbreaks. From the anonymity of their hungry youth into the ruthless blaze of international fame, their marriage lasted for almost 30 years. While he vanished into distant sets, chasing roles, chasing purpose, chasing an identity greater than himself, she was the silent barrier that shielded their 4 kids from the chaos of Hollywood. Together they carried the burden of a public persona that left little room for personal tranquility, as well as distance and rumors. But even the strongest foundations were eroded by time, which was ruthless and unforgiving. After 27 years, the inevitable fracture occurred in 1985. There was only grief, silence, and the numb realization that 2 people who had once clung to one another like lifelines had gradually drifted into different worlds. There was no scandal, betrayal, or yelling. Redford saw the end as the destruction of the only haven he had ever known, in addition to the loss of a marriage. He was never bitter when he talked about Lola. Rather, he carried her memory with honor, frequently referring to her as the great love of his life, the one who supported him while he was still a novice, the companion who put up with his absences, and the one who carried his greatest burdens long before the praise and the honors. Beneath that thankfulness, however, was a sorrow that few ever witnessed. The sorrow of a man who came to the realization too late that love is not always sufficient to bear the burden of time, ambition, and distance. The breaking of that bond was a wound as deep as any loss he had ever experienced. Despite all his victories, Robert Redford was a legend to the world. Even the greatest love of his life could not withstand the storms that molded him, and in the stillness of his heart, he remained a man marked by the pain of knowing that. This chapter of Robert Redford's life is particularly painful because of the harsh contrast between appearance and reality, not just the list of losses. From outwitting villains as Johnny Hooker, to commanding truth as Bob Woodward, or winning an Oscar for Ordinary People, the world witnessed his effortless charm as he strode across screens. However, the man who played those parts entered homes where silence was more important than cheers. He had 2 lives at once, one illuminated by the lights of the camera and the other sunk by the lamps of the hospital. A legend was loved by the public. His family had heard a father reassuring a frail child in whispers, a husband quietly preserving a marriage that is strained due to grief and distance. A strength that no critic could quantify arose from those inner sufferings. Contradiction, joy and despair, victory and loss, light and shadow, was the foundation of his film's resonance. Because he had experienced times when grace seemed unattainable, his performances exuded grace. Redford personified resilience as an unwavering decision to rise, persevere, and create even when it seemed like everything was falling apart around him. The crucible of his humanity, not a footnote to his career, is his marriage to Lola, their decades of devotion and disintegration, the devastating loss of Scott, the protracted battle and final goodbye to Jaime, and the separation of 2 people who once thought that love could overcome all obstacles. The silences, the ones rooted in sorrow, dignity, and perseverance, belong to Robert Redford, the man, but the applause will always belong to Hollywood. And now that he is gone, his greatest legacy lies in those quiet moments just as much as in the applause. Robert Redford did not idly float through the romances that tabloids conjured up in the years following the dissolution of his marriage. He moved carefully, trying to see if his heart, broken by time and loss, could still take a chance on trust. Warmth burst forth in brief bursts, each bearing its own truth. There was admiration and the brief joy of 2 creators meeting with Sonia Brahe, whose artistry and fire matched his restless energy. The chemistry with Lena Olin during the 1990 Havana filming was so obvious that it seemed destined for more. But the harshness of reality outweighed the script's promise. Others, such as Kathy O'Ear, the costume designer, stood silently next to him, a kind, stabilizing force when the weight of celebrity felt overwhelming. These relationships weren't failures. Rather, they were flimsy attempts to bridge the gap between his former self and the person he was trying to become. But none survived. Every conclusion left a scar, reopening the wound of a marriage that he still carried like an unhealed wound. "I always wanted love to steady me, but I also knew too well how devastating it is when it disappears," he said in private. The sharpest glimpse came from Jane Fonda, who had known him for decades. He had the ability to pull you in, but he always kept something back, like a guard at a door that no one else could open. That distance was survival, not apathy. Redford had experienced what most people's hearts could not: the loss of a baby son, the protracted illness and eventual death of another, and the disintegration of the love that had characterized his early years. The harsh reality that love is both a source of salvation and destruction was revealed to us as we emerged from those storms. Reaching for it is also a risk of breaking again. Nevertheless, he continued to reach. Beneath the Hollywood icon's flawless exterior was a man seeking resonance rather than conquest, longing for a companion who could experience the quiet of the night rather than the glitz of premieres. He occasionally found it for a season, and other times only for a brief period of time. Every time he left, he was left with both sadness and wisdom. The ache of nearly fleeting flames that warmed and then turned to embers was all that was left, not scandal. These subsequent loves were merely broad strokes, flawed and unfinished, but genuine if his first marriage served as the basis for his early years. They were significant because they showed Redford as a wounded but vulnerable man rather than an indestructible symbol. A man who, despite his loneliness until his last days, refused to let loss rule his life. He continued to believe in love despite being fully aware that it could cause pain, clinging to the flimsy, unwavering hope that it could also bring about healing. To discuss Robert Redford's life is to discuss not just his accomplishments and roles, but also the unique individuals who walked with him and left a lasting impact that goes beyond mere celebrity. Paul Newman and Natalie Wood were the two that left the biggest impression on him, two friends who joined at different points in time, but whose exits left gaps that no standing ovation could ever cover. When they were both still young actors stumbling into the ruthless glare of Hollywood in the early 1960s, Natalie entered his orbit. This property is condemned, and they collaborated on Inside Daisy Clover, and what started out as a business collaboration swiftly developed into a trust akin to that of siblings, two frail souls clinging to one another in a merciless industry. Later on, Redford would remember how her generosity supported him during those unsure years, and how she cheered him on when he stumbled during the nerve-wracking transition from stage to screen. He never forgot the delicate balance of steel and vulnerability she carried. Then in 1981, when he was at the top of his game, he received the call that broke him. Natalie's life ended abruptly in waters that left more questions than answers when she drowned at the age of 43. It was a headline to the world. Redford saw it as the hollow where a friend's laughter had once resided, the ruthless silence of a voice he had leaned on. Although he didn't talk much about her passing, people who knew him were aware of the cruel reminder that even the brightest lights can go out in an instant. She was radiant in memory, eternally young but eternally gone. Paul Newman's death decades later was a slower, more profound wound than Natalie's loss, which came suddenly. That period of time only grew longer. Their chemistry lit up the screen the moment they teamed up in Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Off-screen, however, it gave rise to something more uncommon: brotherhood. They shared laughter that cut through even the worst of days, raced cars, exchanged confidences over quiet drinks, and played practical jokes. Redford saw Newman as more than just a co-worker. He was the anchor who, without saying a word, understood the strange loneliness of celebrity. The pain and innumerable unseen moments that no audience would ever see strengthened their bond. But once more, time was cruel. Redford, who visited when he could, watched helplessly as a piece of his own life slipped away as Newman's unbounded vitality faded under the grip of lung cancer. Redford, 72 at the time, summed up Newman's death in 2008 at the age of 83 in a few succinct words: "There's a hole in my life now." It was the unvarnished admission of a man grieving for the brother he had selected, not a prepared statement for the media. It was devastating to lose Natalie in midlife and Newman later in life. The shock of a brilliant flame going out too soon was followed by the long agony of seeing time and illness gradually take away what had seemed unbreakable. Redford was reminded by both losses that no legend could escape the fact that even the great are mortal, and that no amount of praise can make up for the absence of love. But in the quiet they left behind, he was thankful. for Newman's laughter that kept him steady during storms, for Natalie's generosity when he was shaky. The legend of the Sundance Kid was based on a man who, in his last years, applauded ghosts who would never return to the stage while living in a theater of memory. Although his films will always be praised, Robert Redford carried with him until the end of his life the faces of the people he loved, the light they provided, and the empty seats they left behind when the curtain fell too soon. Long shrouded in sorrow and gleaming with victory, Robert Redford's story began to take on a more delicate, human glow in the late 1990s. He then met Sybil Sagers, a German artist whose life was measured by colors, brushwork, and the innate patience of nature rather than by scripts or premieres. Sybil provided quiet where Hollywood demanded noise. She made room where the past had left scars. Meeting her was unexpected, tender and irresistible to Redford, like watching rain fall across a desert. With her, he would later tell friends, he felt the ground beneath him breathe again for the first time in decades. The steady rhythm of two souls who had already survived storms and didn't need to rush was what gave birth to their love, not the fever of youth. He was not the public idol, the legend or the star Robert Redford with Sybil. He was just a man who had experienced loss but was no longer overcome by it. When they got married in 2009 at the age of 73, Redford put it this way: "It feels like a new life." His words were devoid of glitz, but full of truth. A lifetime of searching and longing for the peace that had eluded him for so long was concealed behind that simple statement. Together they wove a calling in addition to love. They created The Way of the Rain, a piece that was part prayer and part art from their Santa Fe home, under expansive skies that could contain both silence and unexpected rain. Redford gave stories of the earth's brittle beauty and impending danger a steady, solemn voice, while Sybil painted with movement and light. It was art to audiences. It was devotion to them. Redford wasn't performing in those evenings when pictures of water rippled across the stage and music rose like a desert wind. Beside the woman who had become his partner and have become his haven, he was speaking from his soul. There was a gentleness in this last chapter of his life that was not in any of the others. He had walked through deserts of grief and had finally found the sound of rain. He was no longer the young husband counting borrowed dollars in 1958, the broken father at a child's hospital bed, or the friend gazing at empty chairs where laughter once resided. He was not asked to prove himself or bear the burden of legend by Sybil. For her, love meant calm, an opportunity to breathe, not survival. He finally realized that healing was the presence of grace rather than the absence of wounds. The scars were still there, but he learned to live with them as if they had been softer by water, smoothed out over time, and no longer sharp enough to sever. Robert Redford found what he had been missing for the majority of his life in Sybil's company: a calm harbor, a hand that steadied without asking, and a love that healed without conditions. Then the curtain came down. Robert Redford's stride, once strong enough to traverse mountains and movie sets, slowed into measured steps in his last years. His once persuasive voice faded into a frail murmur. He was always connected to the earth and to Sibila, the woman who had brought him rain after decades of drought, but his mind remained sharp. With the quiet dignity that had characterized him since childhood, he endured the weariness of years spent defying time and the scars of illness behind closed doors. Then September 16, 2025, arrived. He let out a final breath in the quiet of his Sundance, Utah home, where the vast desert sky loomed above him, and the quiet of the natural world enveloped him. The quiet of inevitable death, a single breath that sealed the last act of a life that had endured hardships, suffered losses, and persisted in hope, marked his departure rather than any fanfare. It marked the end of an era for the entire world. For his family, it was the abrupt breakdown of the tenuous harmony they had created around him, the disintegration of their very core. For Sybil, the suffering was indescribable destruction. She had been his rock, his silent and artistic collaborator, the hand that calmed his storms, once resonating with music, paintings, and hushed prayers for the earth. Their home now sounded empty. There was only the roar of silence where his voice had described her art. There was nothing but emptiness where his hands had embraced hers. His grandchildren and children, Shauna, Amy, and Dylan, cried not for a celebrity but for their father and grandfather, who had been a steadfast but scarred presence in their lives. The empty chair at the dinner table, the garden where his laughter no longer rose with the wind, the conversations that would always hang in the air, all of these things became mercilessly tangible objects of grief. Every wound that had previously marked their lives was reopened by his passing. The echoes of friends like Paul Newman and Natalie Wood, whose absences had already hollowed him out. The fragile breath of Scott gone in infancy. The decades of Jaime's suffering that ended only in 2020. The silence, sharper and heavier than any ovation, now fell on his family. The announcement sounded like the fall of a titan in the headlines when it was made public. Actors, directors, presidents, and fans all rushed to name his greatness as tributes poured in. However, the mourning was private and undocumented in the peaceful state of Utah. Sybil held on to the mementos that still had his touch. The chair by the window that would never again support his weight, the scarf that carried his scent, and the sketch he had left midline. His children wept because they had already experienced too much loss. Their sorrow was unadulterated by myth and unadulterated by absence. They found it impossible to reconcile the paradox that every room in that house now echoed both with and without him. However, they will continue it as he did, honoring him not in the spotlight of premieres but in the quiet rituals of memory, in the storm that reminds us of his tenacity, in the rain that whispers of healing, and in the quiet that holds his teachings. Because the resilience of the human heart, not the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, was what made Robert Redford truly great, and his absence will always be the most enduring presence in the hearts of those who loved him the most. Some legends have bright names while others use their lives as a compass for generations to come. In addition to being the face of Hollywood's heyday, Robert Redford was also its conscious, restless soul, and living reminder that every victory is accompanied by sacrifice and every light by shadow. Speaking of him means talking about more than just movies or awards. It means talking about a man who transformed personal suffering into tales that resonated around the globe, who carried storms in silence and who turned wounds into wisdom. The Sundance Kid, the Sting's cunning genius, all the President's Men's urgent voice, and the quiet authority of regular people will all live on in the world's memory. However, he never gave his best performance in front of the camera. It was how he carried beauty without being blinded by it, carried grief without allowing it to consume him, and held fame without ever compromising his moral character. Audiences loved his face for decades, but closer examination revealed something much more uncommon: honesty. His career was founded on depth, bravery, and the conviction that art was important because truth was important, not on vanity. And he showed courage and vision when he stepped behind the camera, telling tales of survival, silence, and fracture that reflected the scars he himself bore. However, film reels alone cannot adequately capture Redford's legacy. His most enduring legacy was Sundance, the flimsy idea he conceived in 1981 that grew into a worldwide haven for voices that the mainstream might have suppressed. It was never about him. Rather, it was about the artists he supported, the flames he kept alive, and the innumerable filmmakers whose first moments of fame came because he dared to stand up for them. He was brilliant at this. He created platforms for others rather than shrines in his own name. In his view, art was a covenant between truth and humanity, rather than a form of vanity. He tended Sundance with the care of a gardener, even into old age. He knew it was a flame to be protected, and he did so until the end of his life, despite his admission of fear that its soul might one day be sucked up by commerce. Redford's earthly fortune was estimated to be close to $200 million at the time of his death. This wealth was derived from decades of remarkable performances, as well as from directing, producing, and the meticulous maintenance of his cherished Utah estate, which was formerly associated with Sundance. Despite all the figures, he never showed off his wealth. For him, balance was important, and the circle of life should be limited to family, art, and nature. Projects remained on his desk as his health deteriorated, including incomplete drawings, environmental campaigns, and stories he yearned to tell. According to those closest to him, he passed away with his art still blazing within him, the eternal state of an artist who never stops giving and never stops seeking. Because it was human and not flawless, Robert Redford's story has resonance. He suffered losses that could have destroyed anyone: a marriage that collapsed under the strain of celebrity, friends like Paul Newman and Natalie Wood who passed away too soon, and two sons who were taken in different decades. But he never gave up. He used these wounds as teaching opportunities, transforming grief into fortitude and demonstrating to us all that you can continue to create, give, and believe even when life takes away what you value most. He was one of us, demonstrating that greatness is not born of ease but of fire, which is why his absence feels intolerable tonight, not because he was untouchable. Now that the curtain has fallen, how do we pay tribute to Robert Redford? Not with chilly headlines, but with stories passed down through the generations, with thankfulness, with remembrance. Tell us if his movies moved you, if his bravery inspired you, or if his journey made your heart ache tonight. As a token of respect for a man who gave everything he had, and who in turn gave us something far greater than fame. The reminder that true greatness is not fame, but endurance. Not applause, but humanity. Leave a prayer, share a memory, and whisper a word of gratitude. May the memory of Robert Redford live on in the stories he told, the voices he raised, and the lives he subtly impacted. Even though the curtain has fallen, Robert Redford's legacy lives on in every filmmaker he influenced, every audience he touched, and every heart that perseveres in the face of grief. Although he is greatly missed, his legacy and the light he carried will always be there.